The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your hosts, James Floyd. I am a freelance writer for StarWars.com and Star Wars Insider print magazine.
And I'm Melissa Miller, your other co-host. I'm the science writer at Nerdist and also do some writing for Star Wars Insider magazine. In this episode, Star Warsologies is going to chat about climate science in Star Wars, as seen by worlds that have those mono-habitats like Tatooine and Dagobah, and also changes that we see in climates caused by the massive destruction like Jeddah and on Kefir. Our guest experts today are Dr. Kimberley Miner and Walter Beckwith. Dr. Miner is a scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and also a research assistant professor at the University of Maine's Climate Change Institute. Walter is a writer for Science Magazine with a background in archaeology and climate studies. Welcome, Kimberley and Walter.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. This is great.
Yeah, welcome. So can you tell us quickly, what is climate science? I mean, we have a sense that obviously it's the science of climates, but what all does that cover?
Sure. So we use climate science broadly to talk about the way that a planet is made up. So that includes the atmosphere, the way that the landscape on the land and on the ocean interact with the atmosphere, and then everything that grows on the surface of the planet. So that could be everything from trees to seaweed to you and me. And all of that is encompassed within climate science. And then since things are changing in a rather rapid way, we are also talking about climate change most of the time during our conversations in climate science.
So it's much more encompassing than just meteorology.
Yes. So meteorology is definitely a part of climate science, a very important part. And, as we've seen recently with so many very dramatic disasters happening in the forms of hurricanes and typhoons, sometimes it can be driven by climatic changes. But meteorology is more like a day-to-day weather system, and climate science is more the long term.
Tell us a little bit about your history with Star Wars and then whether or not that influenced your career track into science at all.
So I actually married into Star Wars. I saw Star Wars when I was younger, but I was much more influenced by the X-Files than I was by Star Wars. And by Twister as well. I was a huge Twister fan, very excited by Helen Hunt's whole journey in that movie.
There's a Star Wars reference in that movie.
Oh, really?
What is it?
As it Dusty, as Philip Seymour Hoffman's character, he says, "That's no moon, it's a space station," when he's out in the middle and there's a giant tornado going on.
Perfect.
Classic. Love it.
Sorry, getting us off track.
No, it all comes back to Star Wars, as it should.
So I basically became a climate scientist because I wanted to find a way to have a professional career and hike. I've always wanted to spend as much time as possible out in the wilderness, hiking around, finding new things, observing, exploring, and then, there's a big crisis going on. So I wanted to be part of the solution and be someone who helps and educates. So then I met my partner and he was very interested in Star Wars and knew everything about Star Wars, had read all the comic books, had seen all of the weird spin-off holiday episodes, everything. And so I was indoctrinated later on in my life.
Well done, Walter.
Thank you. Yes. Ever since I was a small kid, I can remember being a huge part of my life. In terms of my professional journey, I don't know how big of an impact it had when I decided I wanted to pursue archaeology. That was really DuckTales. A lot of people think it's Indiana Jones, the other Lucasfilm. But no, it was DuckTales that really brought me there. But I do want to say that if Dr. Aphra was a thing when I was younger, that would have hooked me.
Yeah,
Amazing.
She's awesome.
Yeah. Love it. That's great. That's an unconventional one. I don't think I've heard that one before, but I love it. And yeah, Kimberley, you're in good company. The Scully effect is a real scientifically studied phenomenon about women who saw Dana Scully and were like, yes, please, more of that, and became scientists.
Yeah, I'm a science ambassador for AAAS, and that's one of the things that we talk about a lot is the Scully effect, and it's ubiquitous. All of us, all of the women in this program, all were impacted by Scully.
Amazing. Well, let's get right into the Star Wars climate science. There's sort of the obvious tie-in, and we've discussed this a little bit with some of our various experts, those mono habitats in Star Wars. ice planet of Hoth and swampy Dagobah, and obviously the desert planet of Tatooine. Is that something that's realistic?
So the idea of snowball Earth is an old paleoclimate idea, which basically means at one point in Earth's evolution, there's a thought that the entire planet was covered in ice and snow. And so that's always really struck me as a good analog for Hoth, because it seems like it's very similar. Any kind of Dagobah type planet, I think would be a little bit harder to maintain, but I also assume that there are regional differences, right? So some areas may be swampier, maybe wetter, there may be large stretches of water, and then there might be some areas that are a little bit higher, a little bit drier, have a little bit more vegetation of a different kind. So I don't see any problem with either one of those planets being a possibility based on Earth's planet history. Obviously, I'm just using Earth as an analog, right? So we have to find other planets that we can live on still, but that's what I'm using today as an analog.
Yeah. One thing that I'm curious about, because I don't know, is like, do you need, for a planet like Dagobah that seems to be all swamp, do you need an ocean or large open bodies of water to do that? Or can you just have all swamp, all wetlands?
Well, I would say it depends on the evolution of the planet. So I think at some point in Dagobah's history, there were probably really large bodies of water, because otherwise, where are the small bodies of water emergent from, right? But I don't necessarily think that they have to exist at the same time. I think that there could be an evolutionary process that this planet is going through. We also don't know that much about the vegetation as far as, how it drives the communities, how it drives the ecosystem variation. So you could have vegetation that is able to maintain water bodies in a way that ours doesn't necessarily. Maybe there's less transference between the atmosphere and the ground. Maybe there's some kind of system where the water is self-replenishing. It's actually kind of a cool thought experiment to think about the ways that the vegetation could interact with the different substrates in the atmosphere, because you can kind of make it up based on what we know is possible within the scheme of Earth's ecosystems.
Walter, is that something, as someone who saw it as a kid, you probably weren't like, well, there wouldn't be a whole planet full of swamps, but like as a, more into it now, is that something that bothers you? Can you enjoy it?
No, sure. I think Kimberly really kind of hit the nail on the head when she discussed the possibilities. If we look outside of Earth and we look at the few planets that we can observe in our own solar system, we have Europa. Europa is an ice ball. These mono environments, they do exist. Mars is largely a dusty area with some high mountains, maybe some ice caps, so that's, could be an allegory for a very dry place. I think you're right. I think, we do see these little slices of the planets in the movies. So we're not seeing the full landscape, the full, terrain of the planet there. While it may look on the surface as being a big old ball of sand, floating around out there in the outer rim, there might be mountains, there could be oases, there could be a lot of little things that we're not seeing. And so I think the possibility of these, if not total planet covering biomes, but large ones, I think that's possible, and I can get behind it.
Yeah, I think you maybe have single-handedly done what no one has been able to do in 30 years, is make me okay with Tatooine being a desert planet. Because honestly, this simple idea of, well, but that's like Mars,
Yeah.
I'm convinced. We still need to go there in every single series, but absolutely, because there used to be water and oceans and things like that moving, and now it's this dust planet. So
just like what we understand of Mars, there was water there, and it dissipated up in the upper atmosphere, and off gassed into space, and we're left with this dusty dry ball.
I always pictured sort of the Mars analog in Star Wars more like Jeddah, simply because it's rockier that we see, but also it looks cold. Like they're always wearing jackets on Jeddah. I mean, it's just like Mars with an atmosphere.
I was just about to say that, James. I unfortunately have to poke some holes in all of the joy that Melissa just got.
It was brief. That's okay.
So Mars doesn't have an atmosphere, friends. So it would be really hard for all of our main characters who evolved in this gorgeous lineage of the Force to walk around and breathe.
Can a planet get an atmosphere back or gain an atmosphere at some point? Is that a thing?
Well, I guess it depends on who you ask. I think Elon Musk would say yes.
I wouldn't ask him.
I don't think we have a lot of evidence for it in science, but I mean, the idea of terraforming, is an idea that we play around with, and some would argue that we're actively terraforming the Earth right now. So I don't know if you can get an atmosphere back. It seems like it'd be really, really hard to do because you'd have to create a bunch of different layers and then have them stay.
Or could you just simply, through the processes of terraforming, just keep releasing gases, transferring the oxygen that's in the crust into gas? I mean, I guess that'd still be a lot.
I think it depends on if there's anything protecting it from space, right? So if there's any kind of envelope that's strong enough to hold gases in.
Well, let's get in a little bit to the sort of man-made climate disasters, I guess. There's no way around it. Obviously, the Death Star has the ability to blow up whole planets or, just really big explosions on them, sort of similar to like nuclear explosions. So that happens on Jeddah, it happens on Scarif. What would be different about the planet going forward from that?
Interesting question. Okay, so let me clarify how the Death Star works. My understanding is that it shoots like a laser or something into the core of the planet and ignites an assumed molten core. Is that correct?
I don't know if it necessarily does that. I guess at full strength, it could do that. And then that's what causes the planet to blow up. But certainly what we see in Rogue One of their kind of low power tests, it's enough to certainly break the crust of Jeddah and cause it to peel away. We'll say it's a laser because it's called a super laser. So it's a super laser.
Okay, like a really great laser, like the best laser. Got it. Okay, so it seems like what we could do is we could either look at paleo climate history, so way, way, way long ago Earth history, or we could look at modern times history and think about the ways that we've changed the landscape using, modern terraforming, if you will. So cutting down trees and paving things over and building buildings. And you can see that there are both regional impacts that are specific to what kind of region you're in. So maybe rainstorms shift a little bit. If you cut down a bunch of trees in the Amazon, maybe the water flows in different directions. You can also see like larger scale. So there's less oxygen in the atmosphere, and then that's going to have changes that are longer term. So I think anytime you have a non-planet ending event that the Death Star precipitates, sorry.
No, it's a totally normal sentence, Kimberly. Just keep going.
You would probably see both regional and short-term acute impacts. Things are blown up and it's a disaster in that local area, but then larger, longer-term impacts as well. So if you have dust that is moved into the atmosphere, it might block out the sun, and then you might have a global cooling, and then that would have issues with vegetation and with growing things. I think that there's a lot of different ways to think about it, and it really depends on the original starting surface of the planet as to how exactly it would form an acute and then long-term response. So remind me what the surface of the planet looked like in Rogue One. I remember loving that movie and not what the planet looks like.
For Scarif, we see at the end, it's the tropical Maldives type planet with the little atolls and stuff with tropical islands. And then Jeddah is more the Mars, but with an atmosphere type place. It's all mountainous desert.
So Scarif, was there a tidal wave that was part of the Death Star event?
Scarif, it definitely hits the ocean, and I don't remember. I mean, they definitely show the glow of sort of the blast more than like a tidal wave. And then in Jeddah, like the whole planet's surface starts like folding onto itself, basically.
Yeah. So it would be like a giant asteroid hit as opposed to just a nuclear strike, I think.
Yeah, because nuclear, there's like a chemical component, right? Because you have the fallout from the nuclear bomb, which is not going to be the same as the Death Star laser, hypothetically. So I think that if you were talking about an ocean specific attack, then you'd probably see a lot of evaporation of the ocean from the local region. But I would still be really hard pressed to think that there wasn't some kind of tidal wave or large wave system that would emerge from that. And then you're going to have those resulting, exactly what we were talking about earlier, the reverberating effects throughout the ecosystems, right? So if you've got a similar to the Maldives region where you've got a lot of trees along the coast, then you'd see, loss of that, you'd see loss of structures. So then the ripple, I think, is kind of the nice way to think about it. So if you think of whatever the surface is and then what it would look like if there was a ripple afterwards, and then that'll absolutely change the ocean air interface. It'll put more water into the atmosphere, for example, which will try to change the way that there is precipitation throughout the planet in the example of Scarif. And then in Jeddah, any kind of emissions that are released from the crust, right? So if there's methane that comes out, if there's oxygen that comes out, heaven forbid if there's mercury that comes out, now all of that's moving in the global atmosphere.
Yeah, Kimberly, you bring up a good point. If we look at similar kind of events where there's the massive upheaval of, deep earth processes kind of thrust to the surface, one thing that comes to mind is this phenomenon, or actually a region called the Deakin Traps. And this was a area, something like 500,000 square kilometers of just constant volcanic activity. I think it was during the Cretaceous period, roughly about 66 million years ago or so. And it just leaked a ton of deep earth gases into the atmosphere. It, likely contributed pretty heavily to climate change during that time. And these eruptions went on for tens of thousands of years. So I can imagine, if you blow 1/8 of a planet off of the planet, you're going to have these massive geological issues that are going to contribute pretty heavily to a planet's climate, let alone everything else.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that big, you're affecting the actual shape of the planet itself, that you're like, we just carved a huge hole in it that's, vaporized, and a lot of that could gas off and a lot of that could, come crashing down elsewhere. And do you think it would trigger like an ice age?
If there was enough debris thrown up into the atmosphere, to the upper atmosphere, to block solar radiation from hitting the Earth, it could cause cooling. Is that right, Kimberly?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it depends on what's thrown up, right? So if you've got sulfur, or like you were saying, if you've got particulate matter that's big enough, then yes. If you're talking about a huge release of methane, now we're kind of heading in the other direction.
No, this would be really interesting because, especially since Rogue One is a prequel, right? It's now happened decades before the timeline that the movies are up to, at least. We never return, and I think that could be a really interesting thing, even if it's just someone looking at it on a star chart or something like that, like, oh, Jeddah, and now it's like this, or oh, Scarif, and now it's different this way, or all the people have left, or even running into, refugees from those planets or something like that. Like they mentioned a little bit with Alderaan, since that one's so well known, but that would just be really interesting to me. And hopefully they would consult someone like you to tell them what happened.
I just thought of something that, Jeddah is where they mine the Kyber crystals. Like, what happens when you get a lot of Kyber crystals sublimed into the atmosphere? What would that do? And what would happen?
Because it's like, oh, well, let me explain the properties of Kyber crystals to you. Like,
yes.
I don't know. Like,
could you turn like the planet into a giant Kyber crystal and use it for a really big lightsaber? Yeah,
all right. So I think it depends on the properties of the Kyber crystals, including the reflectivity and the opportunities for it to absorb light. If there's any kind of other types of absorption, if the crystals are able to bond with other particles, then you could have a lot of weird interactions going on in the atmosphere. You could even have the crystals and other particles going together and forming kind of mega structures of some kind. But I think that it would really depend on the crystalline structure of the crystals as to how much energy they either take up or reflect.
Yeah, I really love this idea that now Jeddah, anyone who survived and is living on the planet, is breathing Kyber crystal dust potentially. And what does that do to like their force abilities, or
I don't know. I think they're just going to get mesothelioma.
I mean, potentially, but
it's a lot nicer idea if suddenly they're just all force sensitive.
Right.
And
blowing it up, the Empire actually created, a whole bunch more people who are force sensitive or something.
We'll switch gears from blowing holes in planets. We'll talk about Coruscant. It's kind of the opposite. It's a city-wide planet, or a planet-wide city, and it's built up so much that there's really no natural terrain left. They describe it as having these buildings so tall that there's multiple layers of climate kind of vertically stacked, that you have the open sunshine and clouds at the top. And as you start going down, there's places where sunlight never reaches, and the hydrological cycle, it just kind of goes up to a certain height and then it rains down, and then, it gets sucked back up again, but never comes back out to the top. Is that possible? Or...
So I am very confused. So what is driving the hydrological cycle if there's no vegetation on the planet?
Lots and
no water bodies on the planet.
Lots and lots of air conditioning?
Drippy pipes.
No, that's not a thing. So I would argue that if you don't have any vegetation, you don't have an atmosphere. And then the rain is now kind of a superfluous conversation. I'm looking at pictures of Coruscant right now, and this looks pretty ick. I don't know how they maintain an atmosphere.
Well, they could,
Interesting.
it's the capital planet, so they could either have ways of just simply making gas or importing it.
Well,
That
yeah,
that
here's
they're
the thing. We see when we were talking about Scarif, these planet-wide shields, right? They could have something like that that holds in atmosphere or pipes in atmosphere or something like that. We don't see anything like it, but that is one way of doing it. We know they have the technology to at least surround an entire planet with some sort of force field.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit harder to speculate from a scientific side on things like that because it is so far in left field now, and we're just making these big assumptions about how this is possible. Based on what we know, let's say again, using Earth as an analog, this wouldn't be possible to have a planet that's completely built up. And, I do have to ask, would you guys want that? That sounds terrible. It sounds like an absolute nightmare place to live.
For most of the people there, it is.
Yeah, I've definitely always thought that about Coruscant of like, why would you want to live there and why do so many people? Like it's where the Jedi headquarters is, it's where the Senate for the, Galactic Empire and the Republic and whoever they are at the time is. And I've never understood the appeal.
Yeah, it looks really icky. And I remember like some bad stuff went down in the Senate. And I'm wondering if it would have gone better if they had gone for lovely little walks along the bay or if they had gotten to sit under some trees and have some serious conversations. Maybe things wouldn't have gone so sideways.
That is a really good point that, while there is a good aesthetic for a lot of the nice parts of Coruscant, but yeah, there's no green, that there's no nature. What does that do psychologically to people? And what does it do when you have, 1 trillion people? That's what they kind of estimate the population of Coruscant as. And, there's, whole communities that never see daylight, that they live so far down in the lower levels that, it's constant night. And, what does that do psychologically for species that, evolved living in some kind of night cycle?
Yeah. Think about the smell. Having no vegetation, having almost no precipitation. Think about just the stink of it. We're getting kind of into Matrix territory here now, but just think about the stink of all of these different creatures living so close together with absolutely no vegetative buffer. It sounds terrible.
I remember there was a Ralph McQuarrie concept image of the planet in one of the old Art of Star Wars books. Like I think it was the original Art of Star Wars. And it showed this plaza in Coruscant with just this little rock sticking up out of the city. And it was the peak of the highest mountain on the planet before it was built up. And it was just a little rock that was still there. So that's like the last piece of the crust you could see was just this little triangle of rocks in this giant plaza.
And they had brought that into Clone Wars, I think, that there's a little plaza and you see the characters go by and you see this one thing that looks just like a little triangular rock. And that's,
and that's Everest.
Peak. Right. Yeah.
So just to harp on this a little bit more, I'm looking at the concept images of the Return of the Jedi ending 1983 versus 2011 and how there were explosions. There were fireworks all over the city. And you can think about how horrible the pollution must have been just from that firework exhibit, because there would have been nothing to drive the winds because, as we know, vegetation drives a lot of our wind. And there would have been absolutely no way to kind of remove it from the atmosphere through precipitation. So it would have just hung there, just being this awful, stinky smell after the fireworks exhibit.
Well, couldn't they kind of technology their way out of this by like, oh, we need winds, we're going to build basically things that cause wind, and then we can have it push through these canyons of buildings? And
so this is the same argument that we have around technologizing ourselves out of climate change. And I don't think so. I don't think you can just make new and interesting technology to do what an entire planet species does.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. When James was asking the question, and I understand rejecting the premise of the question when it comes to Coruscant, but are there cities here on Earth that are so built up and so tall that there are different climate zones within a building or within, a downtown area or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I believe Hong Kong, for example, is built on a slope. And so, there's both the sea level and then there's also, higher altitude mountainous.
Yeah, going up to Victoria Peak.
And then if you think at some of the buildings, for example, in Dubai that are really, really tall, and even the Empire State Building, which is not one of the tallest buildings on the planet, but in the clouds way, way up, and then it'll be, you know, in the sunshine at the bottom. So I absolutely think that that's possible. Whether or not Coruscant has a climate, though, I think is the larger question.
Right.
I think, and Kimberly, correct me if I'm wrong, but cities do have an atmospheric effect. Like there's the heat island effect, and there's also changes in albedo, which is the reflectivity of incoming solar radiation, which can change the surface temperature, atmospheric temperature. If it was possible to have this, where the entire planet was essentially the same reflectivity, that it would just homogenize the climate, or at least the atmospheric temperature all the way around the entire planet.
Okay, so if we were to assume that there's some way that they have an atmosphere and a climate, then I guess you're talking about kind of the fluid dynamics of it. And I think it's a really interesting question. So with no drivers, it's really hard to say, right? Because you don't have any ocean driving the atmospheric changes. You don't have any vegetation driving atmospheric changes. So hypothetically, yes, I think your premise is strong. It could be a completely homogenized atmosphere. I'm also thinking of the word stagnant when I'm thinking of a homogenized atmosphere, where it just kind of gets to be this kind of heavy thickness. And again, the smell is really what's coming back to me.
And I think
again,
the smell is important. I think, what if you had areas like a heavy industrial area that's creating a lot more pollution and a lot more outflow of exhaust, and so that maybe is heating up in that area? Would that be enough to cause slight climatary, is that a word? Nope. Climatary differences between industrial areas versus residential areas?
Sure, but now we're using climate and climatary in the wrong ways, right? So it could create atmospheric differences. It could create regional differences. Mm-hmm. But you're just basically describing an area that's grosser and has worse air quality, in an area that's less gross and has better air quality, and the way that they interact. And we still don't have any wind.
Would that create wind if you had an area that's hotter, and so it's causing this updraft, and then it's creating a pressure system? I don't know if it's high or low, but if it constantly does that, would that then be creating a wind pattern?
You are right that wind is driven by pressure differences. I wouldn't say that an industrial area would be able to create enough heat to create a huge pressure system that would then drive wind.
Something I've thought about, and this is just me ranting against this part of Star Wars, it's just me being overly pedantic, is that they don't show, they show going to all these different planets and almost never needing oxygen tanks or masks or suits or anything like that. The likelihood of all of these environments and atmospheres being exactly the same in different systems and different closenesses to suns and all those sorts of things. Or you just remove that atmosphere is a thing in the Star Wars universe. And then now we're questioning all your questions about the questions. And so I'm just like, we've gotten ourselves maybe a little bit too in it here. But to me, that always shows, the only time, there's like 2 or 3 times they show people using like oxygen tanks, and they're like in open space, and that's about it.
Well, except that we do see people like Plo Koon, who wears a mask. We see other species that are wearing masks, presumably. Zuckuss.
Right, but it's like
they have different
of them amongst millions of planets or whatever. So like the vast majority can just wander back and forth between planets. So
unless it was intentional.
Dun dun dun.
No, I think they just had already kit bashed enough stuff and didn't want to have to think about that. So, all right, well, we don't have to get into that. Them having atmospheres on planets has sort of always been a question I've had about things.
We've talked a lot about sort of sentient caused climate change, but what about just natural processes? Like what would happen on a planet over time if factors changed? Like what could you say about Tatooine? We know that in their prehistory, we know that they did have standing water, liquid water, and obviously it's desertified, but what other things could we see the effects of climate change in different ways that maybe we could then point to in Star Wars and say, yeah, this is an example of that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's difficult to, kind of wrap your head around with the small little glimpses that we're given of all of these different planets and the short little bits of time that we're able to see them. Obviously, climate, it can evolve rapidly and can shift abruptly, but it can also take a long time for these, different planetary processes to work out and kind of evolve over time. So looking at a planet like, I don't know, we could just say Hoth, for example, was it always an ice ball, or were there some orbital mechanics that drifted a little farther away from the sun of its system that caused it to become more frozen, kind of like the snowball Earth idea, that Kimberley talked about earlier. So, those kind of things could be very long-term natural processes that we're just now seeing in little slices. Planets like Kashyyyk, it could just be in this beautiful little zone where its ecosystems and its the climate dynamics are working in a certain way currently, where it's able to grow these massive trees and these huge forests and these lush, almost Pacific Northwest style jungles. But, that could just be a slice of a window of an ever-growing, ongoing process.
Yeah, and I do think that that's a good point. I think that all planetoids, I think all celestial bodies evolve, right? They change. Whether or not we want to think of evolution in the same way that we think of it on our planet, they change over time. So I think that you are seeing exactly what Walter said, a slice of time in each of these planets' histories. And some of them are being forced, right? So you've got, Tatooine being forced in a different direction. You've got the Death Star interacting with, Jeddah, and those are kind of changing the direction of the planet. But I think that we're given time, given interactions with the larger system, star system around it, that you would see evolution of planets, much like you've seen on Earth, right? Whether it's an asteroid, whether it's the introduction of oxygen into the atmosphere, there's a lot of different things that's changed the surface of this planet and continue to, right? We are actively changing the surface of the planet right now, and we are in natural processes just the same way that all of these other things were.
Kimberley, do you see sort of parallels with Star Wars and, climate change science here on Earth? I mean, I always feel like some of George Lucas's idea is obviously the rebels good, Empire bad, but just that sort of like taking of resources and doing whatever you need to, imperialistic, literally, mindset.
No, I think there's a couple different parallels that you can see really directly. And it's almost like when we're talking about these planetary ecosystems that are maybe, monocultural, it's almost like he's taken small ecosystems from Earth and made them into entire planets, right? So that's kind of a cool premise. You've got a desert planet instead of a desert ecosystem. You've got a wetlands planet instead of a wetlands ecosystem. And then I think you also are seeing, especially in the more recent movies and series, this really strong distinction between people who are engaging with the land and protecting the land, protecting their ecosystem, versus, the Death Star just doesn't care, just going to go and destroy. And I absolutely do think that you're seeing this dichotomy on purpose, and it's forcing the audience to kind of choose a narrative, choose a side. And since, I think we're meant to often align ourselves with the Jedi, then those are the folks who are not destroying planets. So you kind of see the allegory there pretty directly.
Yeah, I think, we see very much that the developed planets that are part of the Empire are the ones that are getting grosser and filthier. Like when we see Corellia in Solo, it's industrialized at a rapid pace, and it's, starting to look crummy and gray. And same thing with Kessel, that the mining there, and you can see like these toxic pits and just kind of grayish yellow air. So yeah, it's a very sign of the destruction of the ecosystem, and that's sort of mirroring the corruption that is the Empire.
I mean, even just thinking about where the exiled Luke lives, right? The island that he lives on with all the porgs.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a beautiful, lovely place that he's chosen to hide away from everyone and not participate in Star Wars. I'm biased against Luke.
And I think this conversation kind of feeds into a lot of the discussions that are happening right now about climate justice, right? Like you see, the planet like Ferris, if we want to bring up Andor real quick, like it's a scrapyard. It's a junkyard for old war machines. And the people who were living there before the Clone Wars, they have to deal with this now, and they're evolving by essentially being indentured servitude to break the stuff down into scrap to feed the war machine of the new Empire. But it goes on. Kessel, there are some shots in the Clone Wars cartoon where you see one half of the planet and it's beautiful, beautiful forests and trees, and you go to the other side and it's just barren, toxic mines, spice mines forever. The people who are living there are the ones dealing with that. You have planets like Ryloth, where the entire population was wrapped up and brought into the Imperial war machine as slaves essentially. So there's this idea that we're seeing, the greed, the corporate greed, the big war machines, the empire, the colonialist, venture that is this big thing going into these small places and taking what they need and leaving nothing behind. And I think that is happening around the world, and we're seeing it right now, which is leading to things like climate refugees. It's leading to things like disparities in disease prevalence and poverty, and it just goes across the board. So I think there's a lot of that discussion that could be had too.
So kind of given that, do you think that anywhere sentient beings settle, there will be sentient cause climate change? Is that inevitable? Or will people be able to say, okay, we're going to try and protect the climate the way it is and be able to do that while also settling?
So I don't think organisms have to be sentient to cause climate change, right? When the atmosphere changed into an oxygenated atmosphere, these were singular cellular organisms that did that. So I definitely don't think they need to be sentient.
But just as a conscious effort, though, to say, hey, we're coming to this planet, we want to keep it the way it is, but we also want to settle it. Is it inevitable that we would cause climate change by just showing up?
So I kind of think that that's a little bit of a colonialist mentality, in that somehow the human presence would change the land. And that's just really not inherently true. And you do see that throughout Earth's history, that there's a number of different human civilizations, cultures that are able to live with the land in a way that is regenerative and restorative to both. And it's really an emergent modern problem of colonialism and imperialism that you start to see climate change, or these, denuded areas, deforestation. None of those are inherent in the relationship between humans and the land, I believe.
Oh, that's good to know. I feel like then out of the millions of species and planets and stuff like that in Star Wars, then maybe the odds are pretty good.
I think maybe even the odds are good for our planet. We just need to do a little bit better job listening to cultures that are better adapted for living on our planet.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, well, we should wrap up. I'm curious about, if someone wants to get into your field, Kimberley, what was a little bit of your, school path, and what would you suggest for someone who is interested in becoming a climate scientist?
Sure. So I took kind of a windy path. I did a lot of different things in between my undergrad, when I thought I was going to be a farmer full time, and when I went back to get my master's degree. It's really open to people how they want to pursue this kind of work, but higher education definitely helps, getting a master's degree or a PhD if you want to be an actual climate scientist. But if you want to be participating in, fighting the climate crisis, if you want to be someone who works in conservation or natural resources, there's a lot of different ways to take that path, and a lot of hands-on opportunities, both through the government section, nonprofits, private. So getting into this field, I think, is becoming more and more open and more possible. But definitely studying, at least in bachelor's, maybe master's and PhD, earth science is a really strong way to go.
And what about you, Walter, whether or not you want to talk about archaeology a bit or your science writing?
Sure. Well, I think in both, actually, more so in science writing, less so in archaeology. But I think if you want to pursue science communication, if you want to be a science writer, if you want to talk about science to the greater public, you have to have a passion for storytelling. And I think it's kind of why we're all here right now. Star Wars is an amazing story, and there are stories within the story, and there are stories within those stories. And it's the same for science. There's always a story behind the research, whether it's astrophysics, whether it's molecular biology, whether it's climate and earth sciences. So if you have a passion for storytelling and you have a passion for science, you can merge those things and really do a service to the world and share science with everybody. There's some really fascinating, exciting things to talk about.
Last and most important question is, who is your favorite Star Wars character?
So I think I'm going to have to go with the oldies but goodies. I have always admired Leia's journey from being princess in distress to being general. But I also really like Rey a lot, and I really like Rey's fortitude. I think all of the new characters are pretty awesome, but off the top of my head, those are going to be my favorites.
It's a really tough question. I would have to say that Dr. Aphra, just because she's the first real archaeologist in the Star Wars canon, which is lovely. There's some really good stories with her, and also probably Ahsoka Tano. I feel like she brings a really good balance to our understanding of the Jedi and how they are supposed to function in air quotes and how they do function in air quotes,
Mhm.
and really kind of like shows that there's a problematic side to even what is supposed to be the true good, you know. And I find her story also very fascinating.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, if someone wants to follow you on social media or look up your writing or those sorts of things, what are some good links we can put in the show notes?
So I'm at Dr. Kimberley on Twitter. I'm also pretty prolific on LinkedIn, Dr. Kimberley Rain Minor on LinkedIn. And I have a website too, same name.
You can find me on Twitter at WI Beckwith. I'm not super engaged on that too much. If you want to hear me wax poetic about, late 90s, early 2000s punk rock music.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for both being here and sharing a little bit of your expertise and maybe a little bit of that sort of climate science optimism with us as well.
Thanks so much for inviting us.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys so much for coming on.
Fielding our ridiculous questions.
No, not at all.
That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guests, Dr. Kimberley Minor and Walter Beckwith, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies, or you know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at Star Warsologies, that's OLOGIES, @gmail.com. We also have a fan group on Facebook. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service.
No topic is off limits, even if climatary is a word or not, or if Arabesh is an alphabet or really just a font.
So we're part of the Skywalking Network. You can find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including classic Marvel Star Wars comics, Neverland Clubhouse, Resilience Squadron, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland every week. There's also a YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of these at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies.